I knew I wanted to write that book. I knew I wanted to write that book before I wrote my first book. But I also knew that I wasn't ready to write that book. I didn't think that there was another person in the world who could do it the way I would do it. And that's a feeling that you need. People who were writing serious novels weren't writing serious novels about two teenagers being in love. The problem with having a young narrator is that they're limited in what they can understand. The great thing about having a young narrator is that their feelings are really deep. My sense of what that book really is has darkened over the years.
Hey, it's Andrew with the Isle of Misfit Books, and boy do I have a treat for you today. We're going to be discussing one of my favorite novels of all time, a book that I believe is woefully underappreciated. And this is despite having been nominated for a National Book Award in the year that it was published, despite having been adapted into a movie not once, but twice, and despite having an immensely popular pop song that was inspired by it. It's a powerful, emotional roller coaster of a book that will both break your heart and make you think long and hard about the nature of love itself. This book starts like a house on fire, both literally and figuratively, and culminates in the longest and greatest literary sex scene ever. Now, you might quibble with the greatest, but I don't think you can dispute the longest or the literary aspects of that title. But if you've ever been in love and felt that crazy-making, even addictive quality that bond can sometimes have, or if you've ever been through a breakup that has just left you wrecked, then this is a book you've got to read. That book is Endless Love by Scott Spencer. And he has very generously agreed to join us today to discuss the writing of the book, to discuss the movie adaptations that were made from the book, to discuss the Lionel Ritchie-Diana Ross duet that was commissioned for the movie, and his career as an author more broadly. We had a wide-ranging conversation, and whether you are a reader or a writer or both, I think you're going to find it fascinating. I love this book, but I also see it as a case study in the way that the whims of fate can carry a book once it's been published and has left the hands of the author. Movie rights, the dream of any writer, right? The bright lights, the big payday, the fame, the recognition. But what happens when that movie just isn't very good? We're going to get into it. Since he published his first novel, Last Night at the Brain Thieves' Ball, in 1973, Mr. Spencer has built an impressive career as a professional novelist. Endless Love is his third novel, published in 1979, and was nominated for a National Book Award that year. Waking the Dead from 1986 was adapted into a movie that came out in 2000. And A Ship Made of Paper, published in 2003, was also nominated for a National Book Award that year. His most recent novel is An Ocean Without a Shore, published in 2020. So he has been there, done that, and has a hell of a lot more than the t-shirt to prove it. And today, he's going to spill the tea with us for a bit. Scott Spencer, welcome to the Isle of Misfit Books.
I hope the idea of coming on to a channel about misfit books is not an insult, because it's so not a misfit book in some level.
I wear my misfit badge proudly. I mean, books themselves are misfits at this point.
That's very true. Absolutely. Even want to kind of start from the beginning, because there are a lot of aspiring writers, aspiring novelists, a lot of practicing novelists on YouTube, and just like how you got your start, when you kind of realized I could make this work.
I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, because partly my father was a steel worker, and my mother just did what jobs she could get that would get her home, by the time not too long after my school day got out. But, so they neither of them had college degrees, but they were very bookish in that way of people of that generation.
Right.
And I wanted their admiration. It just seemed like such a noble thing to me. And also, it was something that I could do. I mean, I wasn't like a wunderkind, but I struggled in school. But the one thing that I was never had a problem with and always got praise for was writing. I had never met a person who wrote a book.
Okay.
I'd never have met a person who even had a letter to the editor printed. So these books seem to come down from Mount Olympus. No, even books that were sort of a little potboilery. So I never really thought that I could do that, but I really, really wanted to. And then I don't know, it was a strange thing in college. I read a novel by Andre Gide that had been assigned to us in a comparative literature course. It was Straight as the Gate. And I thought to myself, that's really not that great. I mean, it didn't seem something that a superhuman person had done. And
Right.
it gave me a lot of confidence. And so I thought, yeah, I am going to do this. And I sort of consciously at that point said, and I'm not going to, I don't have a B plan, a plan B. I mean, I'm not going to get a teaching certificate or anything else that's going to give me an out. If I fail at this, then I'll just starve to death, and that'll be it. So I didn't have any alternative. I just, that is what I'm going to do. And I just applied myself to it really diligently and just wrote and read all the time and got better at it. It was a little before the era of the writing program, so I actually have never taken a writing course. My writing course was going to the library and reading, and trying to write.
It seems like it's so much a part of the experience today is the writing courses. Like even so many people have MFAs, but even without that in undergrad, there are lots of creative writing courses and a lot of schools will have great writers on their faculties, and you can take a creative writing course from them. So.
I've taught them.
I bet.
I always say, by the way, I never did this.
Right.
Don't tell my boss.
Right. You don't have an MFA. You're not qualified to teach.
I think I'm qualified to teach.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm kidding. Yeah, yeah.
I've never had a real job. I've just been, taught a semester or two here and there. But I've taught at, the Writers' Workshop in Iowa and right. Columbia. But no one had an MFA. I mean, the people who I looked up to didn't know what an MFA was. I mean, Ernest Hemingway to William Burroughs, I mean, wouldn't have even known what I was talking about if I was told him I was in an MFA program.
Of course. When I was coming up, it was just starting to be a thing. Iowa was very famous at that point.
Is that where you went?
No. I don't have an MFA either. So. But it was starting to become a thing that one could do.
Come over. You're always welcome here.
I don't think it's terribly necessary. I have been involved with a writers group in Philadelphia for off and on, for 30 years now, but
I mean, just other writers
with just other writers,
academic, yeah.
And I think that community is great, and I'm sure that's what you get a lot of at an MFA program as well. But you might also pick up some debt.
The head of the program there, the last time I taught there, she said, that the Iowa Workshop is actually harder to get into than Harvard Medical School.
Oh, I bet. It's because there's so few spots and everybody, there are so many aspiring novelists for whatever reason.
And I said, yeah, but when you graduate Harvard Medical School, you're actually a doctor.
Yeah.
When you graduate Iowa, maybe.
Yeah. So how long, so you threw yourself into it. How long did it take before you were able to sell a book? And was the first book that you wrote also the first book that you sold?
The first book I wrote, I thank God I didn't sell. When you think about little strokes of good luck, with some guardian angel looking over you, that's one instance. And at that point, I was 22. And then I went back to college. I dropped out of school for a while, and I went back to college, had an early, college marriage, and then had to make a living. And so, could write at night. It took me a while, and I sold my first novel when I was 27.
Okay.
So there's the lost years.
Or apprenticeship years.
It was a novel that, had very little success. And I've had like a lot of really lucky things happen to me in the course of a long career. But in terms of absolute joy and happiness and elation, nothing will ever get as close to what I felt when I sold that first book.
I bet.
It was absolute, inner incandescence, just flying. And it's so interesting. So this was like in 1972.
Okay.
I had an agent, we were talking about at Curtis Brown, whose name was Martha Winston. I was terrified of her. And she took me on because someone I knew, was an actual client that made money, and she was just doing him a favor, and he was doing me a favor. And the world was such then, and for a young writer, that Martha sent that book. Of course, they didn't do multiple submissions then.
Right.
So just do one at a time and wait, 6 weeks and then get the letter. She sent it to 15 or 16 different publishers, one at a time, and finally sold it to Houghton Mifflin. And so there were so many places where you could, so many commercial, viable New York publishers where you could submit a novel, even if you didn't necessarily sell it, you should submit it. That Houghton Mifflin, which is a great publishing company, storied publishing company, published Philip Roth, and that was 15th on the list.
Yeah. Very different publishing world at that
right.
time.
Now there's 4 publishers.
Right. And I know that, back in the day, and this was true when I was coming up as well, a lot of people would publish short stories as a way to try to get their name recognized, right, and maybe get the attention of an agent or the attention of a publisher. Did you kind of go that route as well, or were you long?
No, I've written a couple of short stories in my life. It's a whole different skill, it seems to me. And it's not something that I know how to do very well. I mean, I don't think that could have been a very successful calling card for me. But
at that time, people, I think you could almost make a living writing short stories, if you were really good at it, because there were similarly a number of outlets, hundreds of magazines where you could publish and get paid, which are all dried up now as well.
When you read biographies of Scott Fitzgerald and people like that, he would sell 2 stories to the Saturday Evening Post and take the money and go to Europe for a year.
Right.
I mean,
similarly, he would look at his bank account and realize, oh, it's starting to get a little low. Let me just knock off a story here. I know.
It's wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was. But to go back to Endless Love for a second.
Oh yeah. Which was your third novel, right?
Third published. Exactly. So many people have thought, God, your first novel did so well because it's
right.
The first novel you've heard of. I knew I wanted to write that book. I knew I wanted to write that book before I wrote my first book. But I also knew that I wasn't ready to write that book so those first 2 novels, I worked really hard on them. Anyone who's ever written a novel knows they're really hard to write, and it takes a lot of work. But I also knew that I was learning my craft to write that book, which is a book that because the germ of that book, I mean, not the extreme stuff like burning down houses and stuff like that, it did come from my own experience. And when I was trying to sort of understand myself and understand what had happened in that relationship and with that family, I went to see a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin, where you could just, I'm sure you can still do this. If you're a student, you can get a certain amount of counseling for free. So I was telling him the story, and he said, "Oh my God, you should. This sounds like a novel." I went, "Yes, it does." But I'm not going to write it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wrote 2 books before that.
It's interesting, that idea of the ideal novel, or that novel that you know is in you, but that you're not ready for yet. I definitely feel like I have a book or 2 like that too, and I bet a lot of people watching this feel that way as well. Like when do you know? Okay, now's the time, or do you have to just kind of like make it a leap of faith, right?
Well, of course, every book is a leap of faith, and there's so many reasons you can come up with for not writing it, or to put it off, but you also have to be willing to fail. I mean, I think the willingness to fail, or what is Beckett's thing, just fail better next time. I mean, I can have 10 ideas for novels that seem like really good ideas, but you know what? They're not for me. I mean, it doesn't tap into whatever it is that helps me write. So, but when I started writing that book, it did. I could feel that it made me want to write, and it created language in me. So it wasn't just an idea; it was an idea that was connecting to me personally, and I didn't think that there was another person in the world who could do it the way I would do it. And that's a feeling that you need to write, because if someone else could do it, then why bother?
Right.
Writing's a pain in the ass, and except like that book got struck by lightning, but mostly nothing happens anyhow. So why go through it unless you can really feel it inside you? And I did feel that inside me. That said, I'm sure that my first 18 months of writing that book, not one word of it ever made its way into the final novel.
That was one of the things I wanted to ask, was like how long it took, how many drafts, if you remember, like how many versions did you go through?
I went through several versions. I mean, the book, as it exists now, is narrated by David Axelrod, not the David Axelrod that ran the Obama campaign. By David Axelrod.
One of those twists of fate. Yeah.
What's he doing on it? And he looked a little too old for it.
Yeah.
But the way I was doing it for about a year is that it had multiple narrators.
Oh, interesting.
So the parents were narrating, both sets of parents were narrating, Jade was narrating, and that just wasn't working for me at all. I mean, it's working for me as I was enjoying doing that, and I was maybe it was a good thing to do. Maybe it helped me understand those characters better.
Because as you're writing from their point of view, you're kind of getting more into their head, and even if those words aren't on the page, it still is internalized, right?
Exactly. I mean, but if I had told myself that that's what I was doing, I don't think I would have been able to do it
because then it just feels like an exercise, and you're like, oh, if I'm not going to use this, then no way, right?
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
Hey, just wanted to jump in here real quick while I'm editing this together to say that I hope you're enjoying it. If you are, please leave a like. Please let me know in the comments if you are enjoying and appreciate this interview format, which is new to me, but that would be good feedback for me to hear if you want me to do more of this sort of thing. Thanks a lot, and let's get right back to Mr. Spencer.
I did want to ask if you see, because like the categorization of endless love is so, I think, is confusing, I think, and sometimes confusing for readers. And I think it gets categorized as a romance. That title, Endless Love, seems to suggest that, and especially with like that song, and I think romance readers come to this and they find something that is very different. And like my edition calls it a classic coming of age novel, which again, like kind of yes, but right. I'm not sure that that's quite right either. So how would you? I
wouldn't. If I were the publisher, I don't know exactly what I would do. And my sense of what that book really is has darkened over the years. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are people who read that book because it gets assigned to them in school. Mm-hmm. And they seem to, understand because it's context is everything. There's people who read that book because they saw the movie and they liked it.
Yeah.
And they're going to be really disappointed.
Right. It's very, they're very different.
Maybe 1 out of 30 of them will go, wow, this is the kind of stuff I should have been pursuing all along. But normally I have found that the people who come to that book after seeing one of the movies feel like they got taken, that this is not what they signed up for. When I came up with the title Endless Love, and I always had that title was there from all the drafts.
I figured you had picked the title because it was in the epigraph as well. So
yes, exactly.
I know a lot of times the publisher picks the title, but I figured that was your choice. Right. Yeah,
it is. And it came, from that wonderful Delmore Schwartz poem. But I really felt I was throwing down the gauntlet because it was a time of, when minimalism was sort of ruling the quality literature conversation. And I just wanted to go for excess. And I wanted it to be a big, fat, drippy title that, but that if you squeezed it, had something hard there too.
Oh yeah.
So I really loved that title, and I'm still very happy with it. But I knew that it was sort of, in its own little way, was sort of countercultural, and that people who were writing serious novels weren't writing serious novels about two teenagers being in love.
Well, and just for some context, like this was the era of, you were talking about minimalism, like Raymond Carver was sort of like the sine qua non, right?
Right.
And then, but you also had all of the Bartlemays and the metafiction people who were sort of like going down the Borges route, and they were big, especially among academic circles. So it is like, I can see that it is sort of like almost pushing against those two trends.
It was, and I said in an interview at the time, I said, well, why have serious novels ceded all this territory to bad writers?
Yeah.
Why is it that bad writers are writing about human beings being passionately in love with each other, and serious writers are writing about somebody who doesn't get tenure and
right. Well, and I would say too that like those two trends, like the minimalists, yes, there's emotion, but it's always like super suppressed, right? And you're hinting at it rather than like really grappling with it. And the metafiction people, they're just really avoiding any kind of emotionality. And this is one of the things that I love about this book is it just really is an emotional book.
Right.
But is very clinical about that emotionality in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, yeah, I was definitely in control in that. In writing that book, ultimately.
Right. I did not want to mean like it's an emotional gush outpouring from you, but like it is about the character's emotions, but you're being like super precise, and their emotions, to my mind, like just come out in the details that David observes in just such a great way. So impressive.
Thank you. It has that really, really long sex scene that has some people really, really think it's good. Some people think it's ridiculous, and some people think it's sort of gross. And I will say that when I first wrote that physical reunion between the two between David and Jade was maybe 3 sentences.
Wow. And now it's 30 pages. I think as the years have gone by and the generations have kind of grown up, I think this younger generation is even more anti, spicy, what they call spicy. Like, sex is like even more cringy or something to be avoided, or it is gross. I think a lot of people think.
At that point, I was married to the mother of my children, and she was reading it, and she said, "You got to be kidding me! This is it." You know how it is. You're a writer. You ask somebody for their honest reaction, and then you don't talk to them for 10 days. And I was really bummed because I'd already been, it was probably year 3 at that point.
Yeah.
And so I said, all right, I'll see what I can do. And once I just kept going and going, and it wasn't like to fire. It just kept on going. And yeah, it's long.
It's long. It's great. It's fantastic. I will say, so I came across this in that writers group that I was telling you about, and it's like the test. Anybody new who comes in, it's like, have you read Endless Love? You got to read it. It's got this amazing sex scene, and that's kind of like the pitch, and that was the pitch that hooked me. And then when I read it, there's that, but the opening is such a tour de force also. It starts like a house on fire. That was the phrase I was looking for.
There you go.
But it's, those two real tour de force set pieces, but the way that it builds to that sex scene, the unreasonable magic of reunion, that is just, it blows me away every time I read it. But I think that is like one of those things that people, because it is so unusual, and people who aren't expecting it, it is, I think, kind of a litmus test for this for this novel for readers. Do you want to talk a little bit about the adaptation and how that came about? I'm thinking about the first one. I know that there was one done in 2013, 2014, but I have not watched that, but it also seems to me that it really seems to kind of take the title, but not a whole lot else from the spirit of the book.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, he doesn't even set a fire in the second one.
That looked like more of a kind of a straightforward, bad boy romance kind of thing.
He just doesn't have as much money as she does.
Right.
I mean, I literally fell asleep watching it.
Oh no. Well,
I mean, maybe it was stress, but I mean,
but the first adaptation, the one that came out in 81, right? When the movie came out.
I mean, usually, if a book is adapted, it takes years before you see it, but this came out right away.
Did you have any part to play in the adaptation? I know you didn't write the screenplay, but
I didn't write the screenplay. They were welcoming to me. I mean, they were nice to me. If I wanted to come to the set, which I did a couple times, they were fine with that.
Nice.
Franco Zeffirelli had me to dinner a couple of times, and I'm sitting across from like Ethel Merman. I said, well, this is not exactly the show business that I had in mind. I thought, but yeah, it's strange. I mean, there were a few people trying to get the rights to that book. Paul Schrader wanted it and wanted Richard Gere to play David.
Wow.
It probably would have been a very good movie. And there were other people, and I didn't know what to do, really. It was way beyond my pay grade and way beyond my experience. So I just said, well, just whoever offers the most should have it.
Yeah.
That I do understand. I understand arithmetic.
Right. And selling the rights for a movie, a lot of times it is just sort of out of your hands at that point too, right?
Well, it was. At that point, it was completely out of my hands. At that point, I was being represented by someone at William Morris Agency, and they had a relationship with this financier named Keith Barish, and they sold him 2 books. They sold him mine, and they sold him Sophie's Choice.
Oh, wow.
And, one of the older agents said, and we also sold him Sophie's Place. I went, you mean Sophie's Choice? Yeah, whatever, You want to be a schmuck about it? Fine. And then, he offloaded it or went into partnership with Polygram Universal. And then they hired Franco Zeffirelli because I think the thinking was, this is about 2 young lovers. Franco Zeffirelli made a beautiful movie, or at least a picturesque movie, out of Romeo and Juliet. Franco probably wasn't the right person for that. I mean, there was a kind of Americanness to that story that probably he didn't totally connect to. There was a whole sort of David's parents' left-wing backstory that he found politically repellent. Franco's very conservative. And then he wanted Brooke Shields. And at that point, the expectations of the studio, rise up at that point. We could have a serious financial blockbuster here. They actually hired a screenwriter who was extremely literate and talented named Judith Roscoe, who has done a Robert Stone novel, and she's really smart, and was a short story writer herself coming out of Stanford. She was great, but it didn't work out. Ultimately, they made their money back, and obviously the song that they got for it was a huge hit. But I don't know who gets that. I mean, you've made as much money from that song as I have. I mean,
my heart goes out to you on that, because that still gets played all the time. I'm sure you still hear it.
It's pretty good as those things go. They sound great. That has nothing to do with the writer.
Right. I
didn't get anything from that book except the purchase price, which was amazing to me. And I bought the house where I'm sitting right now.
Wow.
And that basically, in terms of staying alive as a writer, that's sort of that's been the core of it. And there's been other replenishments, but that's kept me going. And now this career is like more than 40 years old.
Yeah. My sense on the movie is that Zeffirelli kind of wanted to recreate Romeo and Juliet, and that and you were talking about the David coming from more of a his parents are communists. His parents are card carrying party members, right? And Jade is from more of the sort of the other side of that 60s progressive spectrum. They're more hippies or more beats even, and so there is, but to my mind in the novel, this is really just kind of texture and an interesting background, but he almost kind of foregrounds that to give that Montague Capulet kind of difference, right? Or the Jets and the Sharks, like to try to really make it like this, like more of that Romeo and Juliet kind of thing. And then I think with Brooke Shields, he had to get her on screen, and so the proportion of the story gets completely shifted around.
Yeah, because Jade barely exists in the novel.
Here's where she comes in. It's like 2/3 of it. You see her at the beginning, right, and then, like you said, it's David's perspective, and he's thinking about her, of course, but she doesn't actually appear until well after the midpoint. Right. In that the unreasonable magic of reunion scene, like that's right, which is appropriate.
If you take that out, she's probably in 30 pages of the whole book.
Right. But it's really building to that. And so when you do see her, it is mind blowing. But in the movie, then they take the fire from the beginning and make that the midpoint, and try to develop more of that young love, Romeo and Juliet kind of story.
It's Tom Cruise's first movie.
Yep, that's right. Very, very brief scene. He's in there. There's another, I think James Spader is her older brother, right?
Yeah, he has a big role. He's Keith.
He's got a big role. So there is, and I rewatched it, and I definitely think it does a disservice to the book. I think the book is very different, but it is kind of interesting just in that like kind of 80s way. So
yes, well, I mean, those kind of movies, those kind of teen makeout movies, have gotten so much worse.
Yeah,
that movie can go from 1 star to 2 stars. Like that book is having a second life in Italy, where it's got where it's been published extremely respectfully. It's just as a classic novel, and they've done well with it there. And it's recent. And when the book first came out, it sold in all over the world. But never in Spain. And now it's just been published in Spain. And again, spoken of, no connection to the movie or anything like that, and has been, greeted as a good novel, and not as something that it is for, a Saturday matinee.
Well, and I think that's kind of why I wanted to, make a video about this, to just try to kind of strip away some of that pop culture incrustation, right? Like the barnacles of the movie and of the pop song, which are just going to be making people, I think, giving people the wrong idea and kind of scaring the right readers away from the book, in a sense.
Yeah, that's the thing. Well, when the book first came out, I don't know if you've ever seen a hardcover version of it.
I have, yeah. Working in rare books, I bought a couple, and we bought and sold them.
It has a very dignified cover, really.
Yes.
No picture at all, just a print solution, Paul Bacon, boom, boom, and it's beautiful.
Yep.
But as soon as publishers are always trying to sell books. You can't really fault them for it. But if they see a way of selling 200 rather than 100, they're going to go in that direction.
Oh, yeah.
And
a movie is basically like a huge advertisement for the book as well. I'm sure that a lot of people bought the book as a result of the movie. So
yeah, it's true.
So this was your third novel, and just to kind of maybe touch on your career post Endless Love, which is quite long and very well regarded. I think your next one was Men in Black, right?
No, my next one after that was Waking the Dead.
Oh, okay.
Which also was made into a movie.
I haven't read that. I have read Men in Black, which I get the sense kind of grew out of, and I remember quite liking it. It's very funny. It's kind of a dramedy. It's got a lot of satirical elements, and I get the sense that that might have grown out of some of your experience with Endless Love, kind of taking off and having a lot of hoopla associated with it.
I think, well, it was that, and before I wrote Endless Love, way before it. I literally had no money and wrote a couple of books under a pseudonym, just because I knew somebody who worked at some little publisher, and they wanted a book about. I'm not going to say this. Yeah, there was a TV show called Mary Hartman. Louise Lasser was the star of, who used to be married to Woody Allen,
right?
And it was like a phenomenon for a year or something. And they wanted to do a quickie paperback about it. And would I like to do it? And they would pay me $3,000 to do it, which I could live on at that point, for 4 months easily. And the only problem was I was living in a farmhouse in Vermont, didn't have a TV, and I had never seen the program. But they sent me all these sort of synopses of it. And I wrote this book in 2 weeks. And I always felt, that was so scummy. It was so, but what the hell? Yeah. So the idea of writing a book under a pseudonym is kind of lodged in me. And I did want to revisit that.
Interesting.
And to have this guy be a novelist who couldn't make a living and then write a book under a pseudonym and have it just take off was really amusing to me. And I'd also added to it, because as you know, you can't just have one thing, two things that'll get you energized enough to write a book. You have to have several things that just sort of buzz together and create enough energy to get the work done. I had read this book by this historian named Norman Cohn, C-O-H-N, called Warrant for Genocide. And it was a history of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that very famous anti-Semitic tract that people really believed, that this cabal of rabbis met in some cemetery in Prague and plotted world domination. And
Henry Ford among them, very famously, right?
He gave every worker in his factories a copy of it.
Yeah.
That thought was required reading. But that book, that whole thing came out of a book that some hack postal worker actually wrote, who just would write, he had like graphomania, would just write book after book, and people published some of them and some they didn't. And this was like a sequence inside of it that somebody excerpted and ran in a magazine, and then pretty soon developed a life of its own. And it was all sort of accidental.
Yeah.
That was just a guy filling pages to and probably getting a penny a page to do it, and basically barely keeping his nose above water. And then 50 years later, it becomes a justification for slaughtering actual living human beings.
Right.
So that was also on my mind. But I'm glad you read it, because it's one of I have a special fondness for it, because I like to be funny, and that's really the only funny book I wrote.
It's very funny. It's very funny. I like it a lot. You're talking about taking the flat fee of $3,000 with then no royalties, right? It's just. I
have no idea what happened after that.
Yeah. I'm
sure there were no royalties.
Well, you probably know this story. Alan Dean Foster did the same for the novelization of Star Wars. He took a flat fee of $5,000,
Oh my God,
but no royalties on that. So that's.
Did they at least, send him a bottle of champagne?
I should hope so. I should hope so. I mean, do you see Endless Love as like the best starting point for reading your
I don't
books,
really know.
or is there one that you would say is better, or one that would be a good second?
You know what? I find if I'm meeting somebody who's never read anything by me, I usually send them to a ship made of paper.
Okay.
Because I don't know, I just do. I've had two books that have been nominated for the National Book Award. I mean, Endless Love and A Ship Made of Paper. And somehow sending people to read Endless Love, I don't know. I just never think of doing that.
Interesting. Well, I would say, like, I'm obviously trying to send people to Endless Love, but I would say, right, like, it is kind of a knockdown, drag it out kind of experience. Like, by the end, every time I read it, I'm bawling by the end. Like, it is an emotional book. It's an emotional experience, which, is what we always say that we want from our books. But sometimes, like, you almost feel like, man, am I ready for this, or did I bite off more than I can chew on this one? Like.
Well, that's really great to hear. I mean, and even going through the drafts that I did, and you develop some distance from it. It was a pretty emotional experience to write it too. The problem with having a young narrator is that they're limited in what they can understand. The great thing about having a young narrator is that their feelings are really deep.
I feel like you don't limit his narration by his youth, and you kind of get away with it. Like, it's a sophisticated young man. Like, he's a smart young man, and so that allows him to be somewhat sophisticated. And I think by the end too, you see that he's like he's an older person retrospecting and remembering what it was like, but really, like, kind of reliving it in a sense.
And that was tricky because I wanted to not be told. I don't want to read a whole book, narrated by, a lovesick 17-year-old. I mean, I just didn't want. So I wanted somebody to be looking back at it, but I wanted it to be. I didn't want him commenting and minimizing it or understanding it for us.
Right.
I wanted him to still feel it.
Absolutely, and that's like it's the tightrope that I think that you walk and this narrator walks. Because if you do have the 17-year-old narrator, you get Catcher in the Rye, right? You get, like, obviously still seen as a classic, but I think is more and more dated just because Salinger is kind of channeling the youth slang of the time, and it just kind of seems more, it kind of dates it. Whereas, I think in Endless Love, like, you're not doing that. There's some of that in there, of course, but you're not really, like, trying to make him seem like he's living that in that moment, and it is more sophisticated.
Yeah, but it gives you a chance to get primal.
Yes, in all the good ways. Yeah.
What should I read of yours now?
Well, so I've written a fantasy, Mirrenwood, and an action adventure called Amba. The action adventure is set in the Russian Far East about rewilding Siberian tiger cubs, and the fantasy is about a hunt for a unicorn. I think the fantasy is probably the better book. Mirrenwood is the fantasy. That's probably the one that I would steer readers to. So it's just been a real treat getting to talk to you and hear your thoughts.
I've had a great time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Spencer.
Thank you.
This has been great.
So if you made it this far, thank you very much. I hope you got some value from it. Hope you got some entertainment from it. Hope you found it as fascinating as I did. I'd love to hear in the comments if you liked this format. This is my first time doing an interview with an author and working that into a video. So I would love to hear if that was successful, if that was something that you appreciated, if you'd like to see me do more of this sort of thing. Please let me know. I'd love to hear. That would be great feedback. And again, thank you very much to Scott Spencer for taking some time out of his day to join us and to discuss one of my favorite books of all time. A good way to support him, support the channel, would be to buy a copy if you haven't, or buy one of his other books. I will have links in the description box below. I would get a small commission from any books that are purchased through that link, but without changing the price to you, of course. I also have links to the couple of novels that I've written in the description box below. They are not as good as Mr. Spencer's, but you got to start somewhere, right? That's all I've got for you today. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next one.